Yo, welcome to the channel. We're going to review Opus Last Will and Testament today. So this is a very dense album. We've been listening to it quite a bit. It's only just released, so this is going to be a first impression slash review sort of thing. Okay, so first and foremost, yes, the growls are back. I think that's probably the big ticket item that most fans have been talking about after, what, something like 17 years without doing the growls on any of their albums. Opeth Michael Ackerfeld has finally stepped back up to the plate, and yes, he is growling. And surprisingly, there is a lot of growls on this record too. There are probably, I think, two songs without any growls, but for the most part, it was way more than I was expecting, which is actually pretty cool. And his voice, his growling voice, is not quite exactly the same as it used to be on, say Blackwater Park or whatever, but he still does a pretty convincing performance here. I think the main word I would use to describe this album though is dense. It's going to take you several listens to really let everything sort of sink in, even after listening to it for like I don't know how many times I listened to it already. But I'm still hearing new parts, new sections. And I think one of the reasons that it feels like this is the melodies aren't particularly standard, at least most of them. Most of the melodic writing and composition here, uh yeah, I would say is a little bit out of the box or obscure, or won't necessarily fit into your typical major minor scale type stuff. Um but it does sound really cool. So, I think overall impressions, I'd say this album is pretty good. I definitely like it more than their last two. I really enjoyed Pale Communion and Heritage, so I'm not against the non-growly albums, but the last two in particular started to sound a bit like, I don't know, his voice was wobbling too much. It was going too far into the direction of like almost starting to sound like opera type in his voice. And some of that exists on this album. Don't get me wrong, but I think that is toned down a little bit, and it is kind of counteracted by having, as I said before, quite a few growls on here, which is really cool. As I mentioned, I think there are two tracks without any growling on it. The very last one and paragraph 3, if I'm not mistaken. But they're still pretty cool songs. The last song is it definitely feels like more of an outro type song. And the first track, the one that has been released, and you've probably heard by now, I think it sets up the kind of mood and tone that this album really brings. So it is a concept album. It is about the reading of a last will and testament of this old rich guy from the, I don't know, what is it, 1920s or 40s or something pretty old school, and how he has several daughters or whatever, and how they're gonna split things up. Um, I'm not personally that deeply invested into lyrics in music. I prefer the music than the lyrical content. So to me, it's like, yeah, cool, it's a concept album, and it works. I think if you go into this album without knowing or reading the lyrics or knowing what it's about, some of the spoken word sections might sound a little out of place to you. Now, within the context of the concept album, though, it makes sense, right? But I think if you listen to like one of the later tracks just by itself, and you just hear this spoken word kind of throughout it, you're like, what is going on here? But okay, so I mentioned before it's quite dense. I think melodically, yeah, it's hard to grasp what is going on in a lot of these songs in your first listen, as the melodies don't tend to go where your mind initially expects them to go, especially if you've been, trained on music or you listen to a lot of music. I think that is one of the strengths of an album like this, is it grows on you the more you listen to it. It is one of those kind of albums. Your first listen, maybe you might feel a little bit confused or something about what is actually going on here. I think the performances of the musicians here are pretty good, I'd say. It doesn't strike me as quite as technical as certainly some other music that's out there. Certainly in the tech death genre or whatever, it's nothing that crazy in terms of the technicality, but I say melodically it is more technical, if that makes sense. So structurally, it is also all over the place. This is a progressive album, right? It will go through so many different ideas, and some of them will repeat, but many of these ideas kind of come and go, and that might be a little bit confusing for some listeners on first go, I think. But I really do think it starts to grow on you. Especially even just the second time listening through, I was like, oh, okay, yeah. Now I'm starting to sort of, and then a few extra listens, and okay, now I'm really starting to vibe with this and sort of pick up what it's putting down, so to speak. I think if you are expecting a return to like Blackwater Park, Deliverance type Opeth, this is really not what you're going to get from this album. Some of those older albums, they had these really long 10, 12-minute songs, and there would be these sections where they would sit on a riff for like a minute at a time, sometimes even more, like the intro to Blackwater Park, for example. Some of the Ghost Reverie sections will have these really long extended sections. That is not really the vibe that this album puts out. That's not to say that the vibe that this album puts out is bad or anything like that, but it's definitely not, it's not a repeat of the old Opus. So, your mileage may vary on that, whether that sort of bothers you or not. But I think what is impressive about this album is, this might sound stupid or something, but it sounds really cool. Like musically, it sounds really fun and interesting. So it definitely is a progressive album. There are many different elements there. We have flutes going on. We have some string sections here. We have a few quieter, softer sections. Plenty of metal, chunky guitars. And the new drummer, it definitely does an interesting job here. There isn't necessarily a feeling of death metal in this album. Yes, he growls and there's plenty of chunky guitars and all that, but to me, after the first few listens, it doesn't necessarily feel like a death metal album. Now, it is, as I said, it has the guitars and the growls and all that, but I think part of that is to do with the drumming performance here. It's not just, heavy double kicks, or there's not really any blasts or anything like that. So from that perspective, it feels a little bit more like a prog rock album that has a lot of metal elements in it, which is pretty cool. It kind of reminds me a little bit in some weird way of Heritage, but except it's not that prog rock, it's more prog metal, if that makes more sense. I don't know if that makes sense. The performances in general are pretty good. I think Ackerfeld does a pretty good job overall. I don't love his type vocals when he does the big vibrato thing with his voice. I don't really like that part of his clean vocals. I think his clean vocals in general sound pretty good. Just the big wobbles is in his voice is not really my cup of tea. His growls, though, they do sound pretty good. Now, the one thing about them, you do not have these big, long, extended growls like you would in, like, the earlier Blackwater Park or whatever, where he's just like for 3, 4 bars, 6 bar, 8 bars, he's just that's not really what you get here, right? It's more a little bit more akin to maybe Ghost Reveries, although that still had a bit of that, right? But it's more, it feels a little bit more like the theater, the spoken growl type thing in this album. But it fits what he's trying to do here, so it sounds pretty good. I think the guitar work is pretty consistently Opeth sounding. The technicality is not the most, it's not blazing fast tech death, but it also is way more technical than your standard rock album or something like that. So it does fall kind of in the middle in terms of technicality. I think their performances are pretty good. Frederick, the second guitarist, he has some pretty cool solos on here. Again, it's nothing like Heritage, not Heritage, Watershed. It's not like his solos on Watershed where he has some real blisteringly fast stuff. There's a little bit of that here, but it's a little bit more, I would say, controlled sounding. And the drummer is interesting. Like I was saying before, he doesn't have necessarily those big sections where he's just blasting or does the, really, really fast double bass throughout an entire, 16 bars, 8 bars or whatever. It's not quite like that. But he does play with feel and obviously he's technically very competent too. Mendez, bass player, he's always been a great bass player. The bass sounds good on this album. I don't know, the bass lines are pretty interesting. I'm not a bass player, I'm more of a guitar player myself, so I'm not necessarily the best one to judge the bass, but it sounds good. It sounds like it fits. And there are some pretty funky metal-ish type sections in there where he's whatever, you know. And it sounds pretty good for the most part. And there are a lot of keys, keyboard, you know. There aren't that many big solos that I notice. So there are some guitar solos and stuff like that. Don't get me wrong, but it does feel a little bit less about musical show off in this album than perhaps some of the previous ones. Not that they were ever the most technical, but they still had some really, really cool sounding, you know, keyboard solos, guitar solos, all that sort of stuff on some of their previous albums. And while some of that does still exist, don't get me wrong, it doesn't feel like the focus here, right? The focus is more on the storytelling and the progressive nature, moving from one section to another. And yeah, we do come back and repeat some sections and stuff like that. But I'd say overall, this is a really cool album. I mean, it's growing on me the more I listen to it. I do think it is a return to form after the last two albums in particular didn't really do it for me. As I said, I really liked Heritage and Pale Communion and Damnation too. So I'm not against the non-metal albums, but the last two were starting to sound a little bit less musically interesting to me. This one does feel like a little bit of a return. There is still some of that Sorceress and the previous one, which I'm blanking on the name right now. There is still some of that influence here, right? Especially with the wobbly vocals, as I like to call it. But overall, man, it's a return to form, I think, for Opeth. They're touring here in Australia. They've already announced the tour, which is a year away. So, you know, we'll see. We'll see about that. Guys, if you enjoyed the video, smash like and subscribe. This is a new channel, so if you're into the reviews, the album reviews, let me know what you'd like to see next reviewed on the channel with a comment down below. Happy to do anything progressive or metal or any genre really, but, you know, that's sort of more what I'm into. So thanks for checking out this one, guys. I hope you have a great day. Take it easy wherever you are. I'll catch you in the next one.